Mike Flood is concerned about a bill in the Nebraska Legislature.
It would allow some children of undocumented immigrants to become law enforcement officers.
6 News' Joe Harris spoke with him this morning about response to his concerns.
It is ill-conceived, and I think it threatens our justice system.
Congressman Mike Flood is talking about an amendment to State Senator Teresa Ibach's bill. LB 894 would require sheriff's candidates to be certified law enforcement officers when they file to run for office. And it now includes an amendment from Senator Justin Wayne to allow people who have Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival status, or DACA, to join the Thin Blue Line. Flood believes it would create problems in court.
If a law enforcement officer is not a citizen of the United States, entered this country illegally, how will a jury react to the evidence that that officer presents in a court of law when testifying? Suddenly, that officer, due to their immigration status, is going to be called into question.
A member of the Nebraska ACLU says the bill is written in a way that wouldn't change any of the qualifications needed to become a law enforcement officer, so nothing would really set them apart from other officers.
When a law enforcement officer steps up as an expert witness in what they saw, I don't see the defense jumping straight to impeaching him on his credibility for his citizenship status.
Flood also fears it would further complicate jury selection, especially in higher profile cases.
There are strong feelings in every county in the state on the issue of immigration. It's in the news every single day. Picking a jury would be very hard, I would think, to find an impartial jury that would look past the immigration status of an officer of the law.
But Severino doesn't agree.
I just don't see a witness's citizenship status as being a hugely complicating factor for juror selection in a case that isn't about the witness.
He adds that Nebraska's law enforcement agencies are suffering from a lack of recruits in diversity, and he thinks this DACA proposal would help solve both. On your side, Joe Harris, 6 News.
The proposal is on the legislative floor and must go through several rounds of debate before senators would pass it and then send it to the governor's desk.